Hello all, my name is Jerry Rothkoff, Managing Attorney of Rothkoff Law Group, an elder care law firm based both in Eastern Pennsylvania and South and Central New Jersey. Welcome to our continuing virtual interview series of the who's who of senior care in the larger Philadelphia metropolitan area. We are privileged today to have Dr. David Weisman, a neurologist associated with Abington Neurology. David, welcome. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's it's great to have you as a neurologist, Dr. Weisman, today. Today is we're recording this and the interview on October 15. So we are just about, I guess, 7 full months into the onslaught of COVID-19 throughout the world and certainly our country. And so I would like to get, as a physician who regularly works with individuals with cognitive impairment, works with patients with all forms of cognitive impairment as a neurologist, I just want to get your quick take of, from your perspective, working with your patients, can you just talk about in a few minutes, how have you seen it, COVID-19 affect the population with cognitive impairment, the patients that you work with on a daily basis? What impact have you seen over the past 7 months or so that it has had on your everyday patient?
Well, the everyday patient is very problematic early in the disease. Everyone was terrified of the disease, and people would stay home. They would never get a diagnosis. They would never come into the office. So now we're dealing with a bunch of backlog as the disease gets better here in Montgomery County. The numbers are down and kind of staying low. So we're sort of back to normal with masks. Unfortunately, a whole bunch of clinical trials that were going to start up around March to July timeframe, I mean, this just put a huge wind in their face and they couldn't start up. So now we're seeing those trials that look very promising start up again. But they've been delayed by 6 months, 3 months or so.
So COVID has really a double effect. It really has impacted those with cognitive impairment, especially the social isolation, but it also has set back actual research in for those with dementia, it sounds like, as well.
That's totally right. I mean, we tried to manage as best we could with the people who are already in clinical trials because we have these commitments and we thought we could do it safely to keep them going through the trial and maintain trial integrity. And normally trial integrity and patient well-being are two principal goals that we have. And they're exactly the same thing. The trial integrity is good for the patient. But in this situation, trial integrity means that they come in and get a dose of experimental drug that puts them at risk of getting COVID. So we had to be very careful because patient and subject well-being is always first and foremost. That was difficult, but we got through it and we got everyone through it on an individual basis. And I'm very proud of my center. I think we did a great job. Not a single one of our subjects got sick with anything other than mild disease. I mean, I'm not actually aware of any subject or subject partner who actually got the disease so far. So, and then the overall clinical trial story is that, you can't do a clinical trial. You cannot perform a clinical trial in a pandemic. You're never going to be able to start it up.
So, okay. So, well, I want to touch upon, what type of clinical trials would be appropriate and how you determine what's appropriate in a moment. But I would like to touch upon the issues related to the diagnosis of some form of cognitive impairment. A parent or the individual or a child sees mom or dad slipping, their memory slipping. The first thing they think of course, oh my God, she has Alzheimer's disease. So, and I see I have people coming to my office who are never actually diagnosed and they come to me and I start asking them questions. They don't recall their husband's name, or they don't recall how many children they have, or the street they live on, or where they grew up. But they have not been formally diagnosed. Clearly, from a clinical perspective, and just talking to them in everyday conversation and trying to ask them basic questions to feel them out what their memory level is, there's something wrong. But can you talk about, as a neurologist, and your job is to diagnose some form of dementia, and what can you just talk about what the importance is of obtaining a diagnosis? Maybe related, certainly that's related to what type of clinical trial would be appropriate for that individual, obviously. But how do you go about formulating a diagnosis? When should someone come in to see you as a neurologist? And what's the value of that diagnosis?
Okay, so a couple questions. Making a diagnosis is just medicine 101. You go into your doctor with any complaint. That could be ear pain. They take a look at your ear and they render a diagnosis. It's really the same thing with a dementia. You come into a doctor's office who's equipped to diagnose these things and give the story. Okay, there was some memory loss, and the doctor will take that information, do a test, put their finger on the ear, look in the ear, in this case, do probably a memory test, and render a diagnosis. And a diagnosis is not the same problem back at you. I see many people who have seen a neurologist and have seen a doctor, and the diagnosis is memory loss. I'm sorry, that's not a diagnosis. That's not an appropriate diagnosis. It might be mild cognitive impairment, it might be Alzheimer's disease, it might be another one of the dementias. Alzheimer's disease is 80% of all dementias, and a dementia just means having a thinking problem that makes it difficult for you to live alone, okay? So that's all a dementia is, and we know that dementia in general, and Alzheimer's in particular, is very undiagnosed, so underdiagnosed. Doctors are just, not to throw them under the bus, but tend to dismiss cognitive complaints because it's hard. They're maybe ill-equipped to deal with it. There's nihilism. And then even when the diagnosis is made, sometimes a disclosure is not made. When you ask families of people who have a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's in their chart, what's your diagnosis? What is the memory problem? Only about 50% of the family members say it's Alzheimer's. That's what we were told. We were told Alzheimer's disease. So there are problems with the diagnosis. And part of that is nihilism, which is what you asked in the second part of the question. What's the value? Well, right, clinical trials is one value, but there are many others. For instance, sometimes dementias happen in working people. So for disability, just disability alone, you will never get disability with memory loss as your diagnosis. You can get disability with Alzheimer's disease as a diagnosis. And then, crystal balling this, where is this going to go? Alzheimer's has implications for the future, as well as symptomatic treatment. We can make things better. So that's basically
and there's drugs. So if someone has frontal temporal dementia, otherwise known as FTD, is there specific that medication for that FTD diagnosis, I'm assuming would be different than someone diagnosed with vascular dementia.
That's right. And it leads you down a different path in terms of therapy. Right now, all we have are symptomatic therapies. But somebody with FTD who's impulsive and having social disinhibition can be made a lot better. First of all, by knowing this is a brain disease, okay? And the way that people handle somebody with a brain disease can be different. You can change the behavioral management. And then with medication, not sedating, just gentle things, we can make the symptoms a lot better.
And how do you differentiate? Well, two issues. You mentioned about, not really denial of the symptoms, but I mean, I see this all the time with spouses who've been married 40, 50 years and say they're in their early, middle 80s. and one spouse is really covering up for the other spouse, answering questions, not letting them do things. And so it's hard, to, in social settings, etc. So sometimes it's really hard to understand what's going on because the other spouse maybe is in denial, or maybe children, as you said. I see that all the time. So I think that's an issue. And the other issue, how do you differentiate what normal aging memory loss is? I'm looking at the house. I know I put my keys somewhere. I know where the hell is my cell phone? Or
Yeah.
like me, 4 or 5 times it seems like every day I go in and out of the garage into the house, my car. I forgot my lunch. I forgot my file. I forgot my phone and my wallet. I'm running back and forth. How do you differentiate between normal aging memory loss and a cognitive impairment?
Um, I tell the residents, how do you recognize an elephant? You've seen a few elephants and someone told you this is what an elephant looks like. And then you see one more. And what is it? It's an elephant. So the diagnosis becomes actually kind of easy to make in expert hands. It's just an elephant. And so you take a history, you do an examination, and you sort of think about it for a few moments, and that's what the diagnosis is. And yeah, a lot of people have worried well presentations. They're worried about Alzheimer's disease. Maybe they've seen it in a spouse or a friend, and they come in very concerned about this. I would encourage that. If you're worried, there might be something there. There might be something underneath the worry. Not all worried well are well.
Right.
And then the other thing you alluded to is the stigma here. Like spouses covering up for each other, thinking this is like a mental weakness, the refusal of acceptance of the diagnosis. Those are adaptive strategies that are just maladaptive. Okay. This is not a good fit for reality. It's almost a delusional state, but reality always catches up. Okay. It's a defense mechanism. It's just not a very good one.
Gotcha. And the last thing I want to touch on, you talked about clinical trials, and how do you? Can you talk about if someone is interested in a clinical trial for Alzheimer's disease, FTD, any form of cognitive impairment, any form of brain disease, so to speak? How do you go about deciding, and how do they get enrolled in some form of a clinical trial if that's what they would be interested in? Can you talk about what that process looks like?
Sure. It's a very well established process. If it's a good fit for the person to get into a clinical trial, then they're invited. It's an invitation. And if people accept that invitation, they discuss it, ongoing discussion. We formalize that with something called a consent process. And then people enter a clinical trial where we see if they're good for the clinical trial. Ultimately, they get something we hope is a disease-modifying therapy or nothing, a placebo. And that's how we know things. Right now, placebo-controlled trials are going on in COVID. Some people are getting COVID vaccines, some people are not. And then you compare the groups. Same thing with this. It's just a basic science experiment. Some people will get the real stuff. Some people will get a dummy, get nothing, get a placebo. And then you compare the groups. And if these people do better, now we know that this is a winner. And Biogen did one of these trials and they submitted to the FDA now. We'll find out more around November and early next year if they have approval.
And do all clinical trials work in similar fashion where if an individual meets the criteria and is accepted into the clinical trial, it's a randomized sample, meaning 50%, as you said, receive the actual medication. The other 50% receive basically nothing, meaning the placebo, as you said, meaning they just don't know it, of course. And is that how all clinical trials operate?
In general, yes. Randomization schemes can differ. Sometimes it's a 3 out of 4 get the real drug, 1 out of 4 won't. Some trials are actually open label. It's rare, but it can happen where they're just interested in like a dose study to increase the dose. But yeah, in general, there's usually a placebo group.
And do all clinical trials need to have meet ethical guidelines? You have an ethicist and needs to be everything. I'm assuming has to be meet all ethical guidelines besides, of course, clinical guidelines.
Yeah, the way it works is that there's a sponsor who has an idea. Does this drug work? And then they have a bunch of sites, 200 sites. I would be one of those sites. And then as a third party, not me, not any other site, not the sponsor, but a third party, it's called an IRB, Internal Review Board. And they provide ethical oversight for the entire trial to make sure that this is ethical in the patient's best interest, and has merit.
And if someone wants to roll in a clinical trial, I'm assuming there's no out-of-pocket costs to the individual patient. Is that correct? This is all covered either through corporate, pharmaceutical by the pharmaceutical companies, or possibly the CDC or the institute. What am I thinking of? NIH. Thank you. No, that's
there are a bunch of like funding people who are doing legitimate research, and that's right. If you're a subject in a trial that's really trying to show something has an effect, then usually, very usually, you get paid. Okay, so the site will pay the subject. That's to distinguish this from quackery. So there are a bunch of charlatans and liars out there, stem cells and weird treatments, where the person has to pay tens of thousands of dollars to get the treatments. That is quackery. That is specious. They use research as a word to sort of allow them to do these things sometimes, but it's a scam.
And I think we're seeing a little bit of that with COVID right now as well.
I'm not aware of that. I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, I mean, it depends how you want to refer to as quackery. There are, put it this way, potentially some unproven treatments out there that people are peddling at the moment.
Oh, right. Well, before hydroxychloroquine was shown to be worthless, it was called a game changer by Dr. Oz. I mean, it's unconscionable. It's unbelievable. It's completely not in keeping with being a doctor.
Right. And then they have the I don't want to get very to end this. I don't want to get a political note, but there's also I don't know the gentleman's name, but the My Pillow guy.
Yeah, he was a hydroxychloroquine booster. But look, science will always win, and it's on both sides, right? I mean, in the middle is like the best place to be, kind of radical moderate here. Very liberal people do not care about science either because they have their own agenda, right? They don't care. They just want whatever they want. But science just shows what it is. And that's important to realize. What it is, hydroxychloroquine does not work.
Well, obviously, we've been talking about science, and science shall rule the day for diagnosis as well as the clinical trial. That's really the bottom line. So with that, if someone is interested in a clinical trial or looking for a neurologist, how do they get in touch with Dr. David Weisman? What's the best way?
Probably Google, and just give me a call. The office number is 215-957-9250.
Okay, Dr. David Weisman, thank you. You're Abington Neurology and affiliated with Abington Jefferson in Montgomery County. So thank you so much for your time. And it was a great conversation, and 15-20 minutes flies by. And so thank you for your thoughts. Very much appreciated. So, and I'm sure the people who watch will learn a great deal about what you do and the importance of diagnosis and the issues related to clinical trials. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.